Hello, my name is Marne Titchenell. I work for the Ohio State University within the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences. As an educator, I teach people of all ages about wildlife. But in this video, we are going to be taking a closer look at one of my favorite species, bats. We're going to talk about a lot of different things about bats. We're going to talk about some of the fascinating abilities that they have and the good things that they do for us. We're also going to talk a little bit about things that we can do to help bats, like building a bat house, like I have right here. So, ready to get started? Let's go. Just to give you a little bit about my background. I've been educating on bats for quite a few years now, but before then I had the chance to study bats in Ohio for my graduate degree. I worked in forests in southern Ohio for about 2 years studying bats. I really enjoyed it, and so when I started working for the Ohio State University Extension as an educator, my study of bats became a big part of my programming. In the last video of this series, I will talk a little bit more about how we can help bats, but I'll also tell you a little bit more about how I studied bats. Now we have to talk about something important. Are bats scary? Well, the fact of the matter is, bats are often associated with dark places, scary nights, and generally spooky things. In fact, Halloween is one of my favorite times of year because that's when I can get all of my bat-related items. So I hope that you're not somebody that is scared of bats, because it's not fun to be scared of things. But what I find helps when it comes to facing my fears is to learn more about those things that scare me. So if you are scared of bats, that's okay. But if you're still watching this video, then great job, you're facing your fears. So there are some things that we frequently hear about bats, like they're blind, they're dirty, and they're rats with wings. And some of those things may cause us not to really like them too much. But none of those things are actually true. Bats can actually see quite well. In fact, some bats have excellent vision. And bats are constantly grooming themselves. They have to in order to keep their bodies and their wings clean, so they're in good working order to help them fly out every night and capture the food that they need to survive. And bats are not rats. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. There are also other things that we hear about bats that are true and might scare us a little bit, like bats can carry a disease called rabies. So let's take a few minutes and talk a little bit more about that. Rabies is a disease that impacts mammals, and so bats are a species that can contract and spread the disease. This is why we must never pick up or touch a bat. Now, I'm sure this isn't helping you calm any fears that you may have of bats, but the good news is rabies is rare in bats. Less than 1% of bats actually have the disease. Now, perhaps you're wondering about other diseases. Bats have been in the news a lot lately in regard to the coronavirus. The coronavirus belongs to a family of viruses called beta coronaviruses, and there are a lot of different beta coronaviruses found in wild bat populations. It is presumed that the original strain of the coronavirus originated in bats, but how it got from the bat into the human population is still a mystery that is being studied. There is very likely an intermediate host, but that species has not yet been identified. So the coronavirus is not circulating among wildlife populations right now. That said, there is still so much that is unknown about the coronavirus. But right now we know that it is not spread from bats directly to humans. And we know that we are not at risk from our North American bat species. It's important to look to the science to help us understand how best to protect people as well as wildlife, and to not scapegoat bats or any other wildlife species. Now, what I find particularly interesting is that, yes, while bats harbor a wide variety of viruses, they are also immune to them. And perhaps they may hold the key to a cure or possibly a vaccine, and at the very least, a better understanding of these viruses into the future. Still with me? Now it's time to explore a little bit more about some of the truths of bats, some of those things that are truly fascinating and that I find very interesting, and I hope you do too. But first, whenever you start to feel a little bit spooked about bats, I want you to remember these little guys.
These are young flying foxes being cared for by a wildlife rehabilitator, who is somebody that helps sick and injured wildlife heal and get back to the wild safely. There are also quite a few videos online of these bats who are fruit eaters, eating and chowing down on various fruits. So here's a picture of one such bat enjoying a mouthful of grapes. So let's talk about what kind of animal a bat is. Now, I may have given this away already earlier when we were talking about rabies, but we'll see if you remember. So I hope my younger listeners play along with me on these next few slides. Is a bat a bird? They can fly like a bird, but nope. They are very different from birds, even though they can fly like them. Is a bat an insect? Insects can fly too, can't they? You're right. Bats are not insects. Bats have a backbone and insects do not. Is a bat a mammal? What do you think? If you guessed yes, you're correct. We've found the kind of animal that bats belong to. So bats are mammals, just like us, like cats and dogs, cows and pigs, elephants and rabbits. They are able to keep themselves warm by using energy produced from within their bodies. They drink, or their young drink milk from their mother when they are born, and they have fur. Bats are also the only mammals capable of true flight. But wait, who's this guy? What about southern flying squirrels? I mean, flying is in their name. If you're saying no, you're right. Flying squirrels are not capable of true flight. What they can do is glide. So our bats can keep their true flight award in their trophy case a bit longer. Bats are not mice with wings. They belong to their own group of mammals called Chiroptera. And it is their ability of flight that makes them so different from other mammals. In this bat, and this is a red bat, an Ohio species, you can see the light pink skin over the bones in its wing. Those bones are actually really long finger bones. Now, if you had fingers like a bat, each one, except for your thumb, would be as long as your arm. So now let's take a closer look at the skeleton of a bat.
So here we have our bat skeleton. Now this skeleton belongs to a little brown bat, which is a species that lives in the United States and right here in Ohio as well. And I'm just going to bring into view a little model of a little brown bat so you can see what they really look like. Okay, I'm going to set him down kind of right on the skeleton. And now you might be thinking, well, that skeleton looks much bigger than that little brown bat. But when you get the bones all kind of stretched out like they are here, it ends up looking a little bit bigger than they do in real life. So I'll just set this little guy right here. Now, what I want to point out on the skeleton are those wings that we were just talking about. And so here you see arm bones, here's the elbow, and then as you go up here, right there where my pencil is, that's the wrist, okay? And these long bones that I'm kind of tracing with my pencil, those are the finger bones. Okay, so if you've ever seen a bat fly before, they're dipping and diving everywhere. Okay, now their hand wings give them great flexibility in how they fly, which is good when you're chasing after equally fast and maneuverable insects, right? Now, along with flying, bats do something else that is different from many other mammals in the world. They hang upside down. So let's talk a little bit about the upside down world. And no, I'm not talking about that creepy, scary world from Stranger Things. I'm talking about the upside down world of bats.
So how do bats hang upside down? Because if we hung upside down for too long, too much blood would rush to our heads and it would become very uncomfortable. But in bats, their circulatory system is specially adapted for hanging upside down. They have special valves which prevent the blood from rushing to their heads. Also, gravity doesn't impact them like it does us because they are so small and so lightweight. Even the largest bat only weighs 2.5 pounds. They simply just don't have enough mass for the force of gravity to throw their circulatory systems for a loop like we do. Let's look at where in the world we find bats. We find them in North America, South America, Asia, Europe, Africa, and even Australia. So bats have near global distribution. They are found on all continents except Antarctica. Here are a few pictures of bats from around the world. Some bats have very large ears, some are very different colors, and some have rather odd-looking faces. This bat right here is one of my favorites. Let's take a closer look. This is the Madagascar sucker-footed bat. These bats are roosting, or resting, inside a large leaf of a tropical plant. If you notice, there is a little pad on their wrists that looks a lot like a suction cup. That is how these bats hold on to the inside of the leaf. But they aren't really using suction. Bat researchers discovered that these bats are secreting a fluid, possibly something close to sweat, that enables the pad to stick to the surfaces. But Madagascar wet adhesion footed bat just doesn't sound as cool, does it? So they're named the sucker-footed bat. However, there are other species of bats that do use suction to cling to leaves. And there's a slightly little closer up picture of what the other side of those pads looks like. Really interesting little bat. Now, if you're wondering if our bats in Ohio have wrist pads or suction, they don't. Our bats have claws in place of pads, and you can really see them on this little bat clinging to a sign. If you look at where its wrist would be, you see its thumbs, and on the end of the thumb is a nice little sharp claw. This makes sense, as our Ohio bats are clinging often to rough parts of a tree or a sign in this case, and they need those claws to really help them stay in place and to hold on to those little cracks and crevices. So when we look at bats around the world, there are over 1,400 different species. We have 47 species living in North America. But globally, bats make up 1/5 of all mammalian species. They're a very diverse group of animals, which means they show a lot of variety between the different species. For example, let's talk about how big and how small bats are around the world. This tiny bat, called the Kitts hognose bat, weighs as much as a U.S. penny. It's nicknamed the bumblebee bat due to its tiny size. It's native to Myanmar and Thailand and feeds on insects and spiders. And here we have the largest bat in the world. This is the giant golden-crowned flying fox. Now, despite its size, it only weighs 2.5 pounds, but its wingspan is an impressive 5.5 to 6 feet. So if you've ever heard of human-sized bats, That's not true. This is the largest bat that exists in the world, and you see that it is not human-sized. But while their wingspans may be longer than some humans are tall, their bodies are just under a foot long. And here's another picture of another flying fox, and this is actually from the Columbus Zoo. So many of our zoos now have flying foxes, and they really are a neat group of animals to go and look and watch for some time.
Now here's what I really want you to take away from this video. It doesn't matter if you think bats are cool or scary. It doesn't matter if you love bats or you hate them. And it doesn't matter if you think they are ugly or cute. But what I really do want you to know and to understand is how important bats are to our world, no matter where we are living. So globally, when we talk about the entire world, bats are providing something called ecosystem services. Now, if you don't know what that is, an ecosystem service is something that the living world, the plants and the animals, something that the living world does to make our lives better. So what ecosystem services do bats provide? Well, they help with pest control. They provide fruits, vegetables, and in some cases medicines that we need to keep us healthy and safe. And they also help trees survive. So all of those things, which we will talk about here in just a minute, makes them incredibly important to the health of our global ecosystems. Now, how do they do all that? Well, to a bat, it's really nothing much. They're just doing what they normally do, eating.
Yes, it's true. Many of the benefits that bats provide us come about due to their appetites. You see, flying takes a lot of energy, and how do we get energy? We eat food. So most bats need to eat a lot of food, and that is where their power lies. So let's start by looking at our fruit bats. Our fruit bats are incredibly important seed dispersers, which has earned them the name farmers of the tropics. And many of our fruit bat species live in tropical areas. When they eat smaller fruits, they eat the seeds right along with everything else. Then they fly across the landscape, and when they go to the bathroom, the seeds end up back on the ground far away from the parent tree. And some trees, like fig trees, really need these fruit bats in order to get the help that they need to spread their seeds and survive and grow new trees. Now this bumblebee is collecting pollen and nectar for food and to feed young bees. But by visiting many flowers, it is also pollinating the flowers or helping those flowers to grow seeds that will grow into new plants. I live in Ohio, so our main pollinators are insects. But in other parts of the world, bats play a big role in plant pollination. Let's check it out. How many of you like mangoes, coconuts, bananas, agave syrup? For you adults listening, another liquid that comes from the agave plant. Bats pollinate over 360 different plants, some of which we get food from, others from which we get medicine from. These Mexican long-nosed bats are pollinating the agave plant in Mexico. An interesting thing about our pollinating bats is the tips of their tongues. If you notice, they have these hair-like projections on the tip of their tongue that work just like a paintbrush would to soak up paint. Their tongues work to soak up the nectar to allow them to get as much of the sweet liquid as possible when they visit a flower. And here's a great little picture of another pollinating bat that is completely covered in yellow pollen. I mentioned that bananas were one of the fruits that come from a plant that bats pollinated. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. For over 50 million years, bananas evolved with their main pollinator, bats, to the shape and smell that we recognize today. Bats' role in scattering banana seeds and pollinating flowers for millennia produced the genetic variability that led to both an invaluable fruit and highly productive plant that were selected and propagated by ancient villagers. So we do have bats to thank for the bananas that we eat today. And you have me to thank for this very corny joke. Let's go to the creepy old house, you said. But dude, you never said anything about fruit bats. That's called the banana split.
Now that we have learned how important bats are in other parts of the world, let's talk a little bit about what our bats are doing for us right here in the United States and in our own backyards. So in Ohio and most of the United States, bats living here are insectivores. That means they eat insects. So I want to show you something. Can you tell what that is? So this is the wing of a Luna moth. And I got this during my research, which we talked about earlier, in the woods in southern Ohio. And so what I think happened is this Luna moth was the victim of a bat dinner, or was a bat dinner. And so what often happens when bats eat moths, and that is for some species one of their favorite food items, they will eat the body of the moth and they will leave the wings behind. So I think that's what happened. But anyway, our bats here in Ohio love to chow down on insects, not just moths, lots of different types of insects. And boy, do they eat a lot of them. So our bats have to eat 50 to 100% of their body weight in bugs almost every night. So let's think about that. Think about how much you weigh. And if you don't know, ask your mom and dad or your parents, your guardians, how much you weigh. And then grab a 5-pound bag of potatoes and do the math. So for example, me, if I was a bat, I would have to eat at least 13 bags of potatoes every night. That's a lot of potatoes. I don't think I could do that. So let's check out some videos of bats chowing down.
Here we have 3 videos of 3 different bat species that live in Ohio, and they're all chowing down on mealworms, which is the larval stage of a beetle. So in this first video, we see a hoary bat named for the hoarfrost we see on cool mornings. The fur of the hoary bat looks to be frost-tipped, and this is actually our largest species of bat here in Ohio. Now these bats are being cared for by Ann Wookey, who is a wildlife rehabilitator in Ohio. And wildlife rehabilitators are really important because they help sick and injured wildlife heal and get back to the wild safely. So special thanks to Ann for sharing these videos and for taking such good care of these bats. And what you're watching now, I'll play it one more time for you, is a young big brown bat chowing down again on those mealworms. And if you notice, all of these bats really take time to chew their food before swallowing it. And I'll show you here in just a few minutes how sharp a bat's teeth really are. They're very sharp, and this is why, so they can crunch through that hard exoskeleton of insects. And this last species that you're looking at is my favorite species of Ohio bats. It's the red bat, and you can see why they're named that, for their beautiful orange-red fur. Now, all 3 of these bats are different species, as I've said, but as you can see, their tastes are the same when it comes to mealworms. Our bats' voracious appetites for night-flying bugs is why they are so handy to have around. And bats here in Ohio like to eat insects in many different areas, from forests to agricultural areas to our cities and our communities. In all of those places, they are helping us to control insect pests for us and for our natural areas and foods. What kind of insects do bats eat? Night-flying insects is the short answer, but here is a longer menu if you want to see that. Notice that moths, beetles, and flies top the list, but also eaten are midges, mosquitoes, mayflies, caddisflies, grasshoppers, and cicadas. Now notice those teeth. I said I would mention them earlier, but you definitely see how sharp they are. And again, they need those sharp teeth to be able to crunch up those, in some cases, tough insect outer shells. Now, after all that insect talk, if you still aren't impressed by bats, consider this. Economists estimate that without bats munching on pest populations, cocoa would fall by up to 22%. So for those of you all, and I include myself in that, that can't live without chocolate, give a shout out to our insectivorous bats. Now, do you know what special ability bats use to eat all of those insects? That's right, echolocation. Let's take a look at how it works. Here is a graphic showing how echolocation works. Bats use echolocation to navigate in the dark and avoid running into things like trees and buildings. And they also use it to locate and capture their prey. In this graphic, we have a bat going after a moth. The bat is shouting out into the night, and its calls are traveling through the night until they hit the moth. When those calls hit the moth, it echoes off and comes back to the bat's ears, and that's the orange lines that you see going back to the bat. Now, if you've ever stood in a tunnel and yelled really loudly and you heard your own voice or your echo coming back to you, that is the general idea behind echolocation. But with bats, it's much more complex than that. With bats, they learn a lot more from that returning echo than we do. They can pull information from that echo, like how big the moth is, how fast it's flying, what direction it's going, and how far away it is. It's pretty incredible what bats can do with echolocation. In fact, it's so incredible that we as humans have been studying how bats use echolocation, and we've been using that information in ways that better our own lives and can help to keep us safe. So, for example, bat-inspired technology has helped blind people navigate areas previously unavailable to them. For example, it helped this young man ride a mountain bike down a trail for the first time. University of Michigan and North Carolina State University modeled spy planes after bats. And these spy planes were sent into combat zones to gather information for our troops. There are lots of other examples of bat echolocation and how we are studying it and using that to better our lives. But we're running out of time. I encourage you to take some time and find some examples on your own of how bats are helping us. Now maybe you're wondering if bats make other sounds besides those echolocation calls. And the answer is yes, they sure do. Squeaks, squeals, clicks, those are all sounds that bats make. In some species of bats, those sounds are much more than what they seem. Researchers at Tel Aviv University recently discovered that Egyptian fruit bats are communicating specific problems to one another. Researchers were able to separate out several different calls and determine what they meant. So one call occurred when the bats were arguing over food. Another indicated an argument about their positions within the sleeping cluster. Another call was reserved for males making unwanted mating advances. And the fourth call happened when a bat started arguing with another bat about sitting too closely. Hey, we all have our personal bubbles. But what's even more fascinating about this study is that the bats made slightly different versions of the calls when speaking to different individuals within the group. This would be similar to us using a different tone of voice when we're talking to different people. Besides humans, only dolphins and a handful of other species are known to address individuals rather than making broad communication sounds. So that is one more really interesting thing that bats are able to do. As we wrap up this video, I want to remind you to leave wildlife wild. If you ever come across a bat, please leave it alone and don't touch it. If you think it's sick or injured, tell an adult. And for you adults watching, call a wildlife rehabilitator for advice. If you do need to handle a bat, most often that's when they've made their way into our homes, be sure to wear a nice thick pair of gloves to protect yourself from those sharp little teeth we looked at earlier.
And that concludes this video on bats. I hope you enjoyed it, but more so, I hope you learned something about bats that you didn't know before. And if that's true, do me a favor. Go out and find somebody and tell them what you learned. Stay tuned for more videos where we will take a closer look at the lives of Ohio bats, and we'll talk a little bit about how we can help bats. Thanks for watching. Bye.